Well, hello everyone. My name is Angelia Johnson, and I am the Student Health and Wellness Program Coordinator here at CDU. If you don't already know, July is BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month. So Shaw wanted to be able to put together this panel to talk about this year's theme, which is turning awareness into action. Today, we are joined by David Lee, who is the Clinic Director at APLA Health Center, CDU MLK Medical Campus. We have Brenda Ingram, who is a licensed clinical social worker and trauma-informed clinical consultant and trainer. And then Dr. Adriana Madrano, who is an adjunct professor here at CDU's psychology program. They are here to help lead the discussion around the importance of awareness, action, and the maintenance of mental health outcomes within BIPOC communities. So, as most of us know, there have been years of advocacy efforts on behalf of our community to raise awareness around the impact of mental illness on our overall health. Many of us have actually witnessed this evolution over time, going from stigma or having little to no conversations around mental health to now having a bit more comfort around these topics. We acknowledge a lot of the destigmatization of mental health is credited to the resilient efforts to educate and raise awareness around mental health and wellness topics. Many of us are familiar with the stages of change model and know that change starts with awareness. And then once we have the information and support we need to improve our health, we act on that knowledge and we learn how to maintain those behaviors that allow us to have those best mental health outcomes. So today we will be breaking down what mental health awareness and action may look like, as well as their importance. Then we'll have our panelists, of course, share some tips and challenges, other resources, and perspectives around BIPOC mental health. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the first question. And panelists, before you answer this question, if you can please briefly just reintroduce yourselves, share your pronouns, or anything else about yourselves that I may have missed. Thank you. So, first question. The mental health field is a space that historically has not been accommodating to people of color, both as a patient and as a provider. What influenced you to start working in mental health and wellness? Adriana, would you like to start us off? Oh, we just have
You're on
to,
mute.
yeah, there you there you go. Thank you.
Let me try that again. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Dr. Adriana Lopez Medrano, she, her, ella pronouns, and I reside on unceded stolen Tongva, also known as LA, specifically South Central LA. So, as I was introduced earlier, I am an adjunct faculty here at Charles Drew University for the Community Psychology program. I also am adjunct at Pepperdine University in their Aliento program, which focuses on liberation psychology. And I also do provide direct services. I do have a small private practice within my part of my role. So that's a little bit about me. And so just go ahead and answer the question as well. Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
So for me, when I first read this question, it really brought up a lot of just reminders of how I even started this journey. And you're right, a lot of, when we're talking about even community psychology, liberation psychology, mental health systems, historically, they have actually caused harm, right? Within like Western psychology, colonial psychology has historically caused harm to BIPOC communities. And you're right, to not just the people we serve, but providers as well. And so I think for me, it really what influenced me was that there was so many gaps within the mental health system. We talk about representation matters that includes within the healthcare field, specifically the mental health care field. So for me, it was really about using my identities, using my various identities, and being able to not just provide and be a provider, but to exist. I think sometimes, a lot of times, our existence in these systems is in and of itself is resistance. And so for me, that is, continues to influence and motivate my work within this system.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you obviously highlighted an important word, which is the gap and the need to fill the gap, but at the same time, not shape shifting who you are, but being strong in your identities, seeing the gap, seeing the need, and being able to fill that. So thank you so much for sharing that. Brenda, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Dr. Brenda Ingram. I am also a licensed clinical social worker, psychiatric social worker. So I've been in the field for decades, and I'll leave it at that. Uh, Working for county mental health as well as several nonprofits focusing on issues of trauma, sexual trauma, interpersonal or interrelational trauma, things of that nature. So spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. And so what propelled me into the field of mental health was just a deep curiosity about humans and about how we are, what influences. And I remember when I was at UCLA getting my bachelor's degree in psychology, one of the things that came up for me is that a lot of the psychology theories or psychological theories didn't really speak to the reality of people of color. Um, and so that made me want to get into the field to try and broaden the lens that psychology had. And I found the best way for me to broaden the lens is to go into social work. But then to circle back and become a psychiatric social worker to work in mental health. And so I started my career working in emergency psychiatry. So I would go out and do community responses. I started out in Berkeley mental health department working with the police to go out and help people who were having family issues so that they would be diverted from the criminal justice system or law enforcement into mental health. And so that's kind of been my story, if you will, as to why I got into the field and how I have continued into the field and then even moving to Los Angeles, continued to work in the field of emergency psychiatry and especially with law enforcement and doing a lot of training of them in terms of working with folks who have a mental illness, but also to understand how that shows up in communities of color and trying to make sure that law enforcement was able to develop their cultural lens. So I've done a lot of training with law enforcement around trauma, including historical trauma, and also what we would call cultural trauma. So that's kind of sort of who I am. And then I teach. I was a clinical faculty at a professor at USC in the medical school there. And now I will be teaching at Drew come in the fall, of course, the first course in the undergraduate psychology department on trauma. So if you all are very interested in understanding um, how trauma starts, where it starts, and what are some of the cultural issues related to that, please feel free to sign up for that class. Um, that being said, I think that for me, making sure that I look at what is going on in our context as opposed to only looking at what's going on inside of us is important because we are a mix of what we bring to the table, but also the table itself. And so that's kind of how I look at issues around mental health and why I continue to be in the field. Um, and why I really enjoy teaching potential mental health professionals on these issues of making sure that we integrate cultural issues, but also societal issues and looking at marginalization and how that can create trauma and how that plays out when we're talking about minority mental health awareness. And so really educating people about it so that they can start to not look at themselves from a pathology perspective so much, but also to consider what happened to them. It's kind of like the paradigm shift that we have in mental health is like moving from a what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And so, in particular, for marginalized communities, we have to look at the psychological impact of oppression on what we consider mental health or mental illness, et cetera, and to start to move that needle systemically, but also from an individual perspective, but also looking at different levels in our society. So it's working to how do we address diagnosing, so that we're not just saying, well, something's wrong with you, you have this pathology, you're schizophrenic or whatever, but also to understand that we grew up in a context where we were and continue to be impacted by racism and sexism and homophobia and all those other isms that are out there, so that we understand that when we work with someone, we want to work with the whole person. We don't want to just focus on their pathology or what we consider to be their pathology. Why is that important? Because I have worked with many clients who were of color. In particular, I remember this older Black man that I worked with who had been diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, which is one of the most heavy duty diagnoses you can give someone. And I say that because it causes people to put them on really high doses of psychotropic medication, which is really another form of oppression in a lot of ways. There are people who need it, but a lot of people that don't necessarily need it depending on how they're diagnosed. So in his situation, he was angry because of the discrimination he was experiencing in the workplace. But rather than address the discrimination in the workplace, they pathologized him, sent him to therapy, put him on medication, gave him this diagnosis that follows him forever. And so part of my job as a social change agent is to use that to use my privilege and power in the system to change that diagnosis because it was incorrect. And a lot of Black men are diagnosed as schizophrenic or paranoid schizophrenic because we're saying something's going on with us, something's happening to us, and we're not being heard by the powers that be. And so then we get said that there's something wrong with you. And so being able to educate him about that, um, it was so shame relieving for him because again, there's a lot of shame when people diagnose you and call you this label that really was oppressive to him and made him depressed. And so we talked about that he was probably more depressed because of the system that he was working in, as opposed to that there was something wrong with him. And so that's kind of how I do the work that I do and spend a lot more time now teaching, because I think for me, the change happens at the system level that will impact the individual level. And so I'm really about system change, environment change. I also worked with I look at environmental trauma, worked with the federal government in Flint after the poisoning. And a lot of those people had developed post-trauma stress disorder. And so we brought a trauma lens to that experience as opposed to if there's something wrong with them, clearly something happened to them. And so their responses were normal. They became highly suspicious of the government. Well, the government was involved in their poisoning. That is a natural and normal response to something of that nature. So that's kind of where I find my focus right now, moving not so much from doing individual work as much as it is in doing system work and really making systems more accessible, looking at trauma-informed care and how we integrate cultural awareness into that and how we look at power dynamics and how that plays a role in mental health and helping people to recognize that, we talk about mental health, but it isn't just the absence of mental illness. It is really way broader than that. And trying to get people to see folks from a holistic perspective is that I have a woman who's depressed, but she also can't feed her kids and is homeless. That's a normal reaction to that life situation. And so if we don't change that life situation, we would anticipate that she would be depressed. So that's how I see myself now as a mental health practitioner, is to really focus on systems and how to help systems to change so that they are more accessible, but also so that they are not agents of oppression in the way that they have historically been used in communities of color or other marginalized communities.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Ingram. I, first of all, welcome. CDU is going to be really excited, our students and our campus, to have you. And obviously, having decades of expertise, I'm sure you've heard and seen some things too. So, and you already bring up such important topics of inclusivity, accessibility, broadening the lens of the mental health field, and also self-care and et cetera. So we're really excited to hear about how you'll share through the questions today your expertise of what your expertise so far. So thank you so much. And David, last but not least.
Hi, I'm David Lee. I'm the clinic director for the clinic APLA Health that actually sits on the campus of Charles R. Drew University, um, and also a member of the I am a community faculty member in the College of Medicine here on campus, um, and have been involved in some mental health program development with the HIV programs here at the university. Um, and HIV is where I've spent most of my career. And having spent like 9 years during the height of the pandemic, the epidemic in Houston, Texas, I realized real quickly in a role as a case manager. I was actually hired as one of the first case managers in Houston to focused on African Americans living with HIV, and I learned real quick that, you know, there were areas of need for the population. Especially around mental health. There were a lot of support groups that formed around HIV. Most of them were attended by gay white men. And so, as a case manager focusing on African Americans, I was working with heterosexual females, heterosexual African American males, as well as LGBTQ individuals living with HIV. And a lot of times people would say, um, I want to I need some mental health support, and I can't send a black female to a um, support group of gay white men. I mean, possible, but not likely. And so I saw early on gaps of need, especially for BIPOC individuals. Um, and so that's sort of what led me to the field, and ended up going to Seattle and getting my master's of social work at the University of Washington. But I also wanted to be involved on administrative or more macro level, and so I also did the public health degree there, and continued work in HIV. And once I got my social work license, I started, providing these direct services that I knew were desperately needed by BIPOC individuals, especially those who identify as part of the LGBTQ community, and started doing uh, psychotherapy. I had a psychotherapy practice in conjunction with one of the AIDS service organizations there in Seattle. And Seattle was even more of a challenge because Seattle is not a very racially, ethnically diverse city. So I got into this field, like I've already heard from the rest of you, that, it was mostly to fill a need. I saw a gap. And I rather than pointing the finger and saying, somebody should do something about that, I did something about it, and continue a little bit of that work here at APLA Health, where we also provide behavioral health services to the community. But this also allows me to not only provide, I'm not in direct service anymore, but making sure that people in this community have access to primary care services and mental health services here at a community clinic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. I think you bring up such another element of being able to look at the holistic person and bringing queerness into BIPOC mental health and people who identify with the LGBTQ community. As we know, that have been one of the types of communities that have faced a lot. So being able to again see that need and be able to fill that gap with your expertise and your just desire to help elevate their health outcomes. So I can already tell this is going to be a wonderful meaningful conversation. So, again, thank you all for being here and reintroducing yourselves and sharing a little bit about your professions in mental health. It is so important for our students to hear about and understand your stories as they prepare for their own personal careers in healthcare and community care, and also just being able to learn self-care as well too on this level. So, now that you have all shared about why you chose to work in the mental health field, we will now kind of shift the conversation to the importance of mental health awareness in BIPOC communities. So, to create change in the mental health and wellness field, trust and knowledge must be at the forefront. This starts with listening, learning from, and working alongside the community. And now, in your introductions, a few of you have shared already this, but what are some ways you have raised awareness around BIPOC mental health? What are some avenues that you have yet to explore that you would think would help build that trust and knowledge around mental health topics? You're more than welcome to share from your personal or your professional lens too. David, would you like to share first?
Sure. Um, so I, you know, I'm just reading over the question again.
Hmm.
Trust and is very important, and I think that trust comes from reputable sources and sources that the community is already has relationships with. And Charles R. Drew University has been here for a long time, at least
Hmm.
since 1966. Um, which is relatively long time, and so it has a reputation, and I think it's in a good position to um, to be able to build trust in the community around mental health. Um, I've learned that, in my own work with community, that I can also build trust by bringing the community into the conversation, and having community provide input and give feedback. And also, I've a lot of my work too has been around in research, and people have good ideas around research, and then get disappointed. It's like, well, nobody participated, and or we didn't get enough um, of a certain demographic to participate in the study. And my question was always, well, did you involve the community in the development of the study or the program? And a lot of times that's not the case. And so um, community needs to be involved in any program, or if it's a research study, they need to be involved up front and have input. Um, I've here being down here in South Los Angeles, and most of my career in Los Angeles has been here. Um, I've learned early on that community needs to be a part of the development of any program or study or whatever.
Absolutely, that is so important because how are we supposed to know how to assist our community without assessing their needs? So,
Yeah.
extremely important. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else would like to share on this?
I can add, and I completely agree with David. Thank you for bringing in, the fact that especially when it comes to, regardless of who we are as providers, right, our identities, we still have to gain trust of the communities that we serve or that we, are maybe gathering information in regards to research. Um, for me, I think it's a lot of it, again, going back to how my identities, really intersect. I think that as soon as I tell people I'm a therapist, I'm a psychologist, whether it's like someone I just met or someone, it's like, oh, well, let me tell you about my life. It's almost like you have this like, sign on you of like, oh, I'm gonna psychoanalyze you right now in this moment. But I think that, just again, for historically, for BIPOC people, the mental health system is not, a system that we trust. So I think mental health has always been in the forefront of BIPOC communities. It's the system that needs to build the trust, right, with the communities. So for me, some ways that I've been able to kind of destigmatize or even bring awareness to BIPOC communities, I did start a nonprofit several years ago with the intention of bringing that, community mental health and wellness, particularly to South LA. I'm from South Central, so for me, it's always been, part of my role, part of my, just purpose, that if I was to get these privileges and these identities and these degrees, that I would come back and, use those privileges and those degrees to serve my community. Um, I think one of the other ways that, we maybe for me, I haven't really tapped in, or I would want to continue exploring in regards to, building trust and knowledge around mental health within BIPOC communities, is to, going back to what Dr. Ingram was saying of, we need to kind of, abandon these white theories around mental health and tap back into the ancestral and traditional knowledge of Black, Indigenous people of color that have always cared for their mental health and spirituality. I think for me, it's huge, right, that we haven't really, that Western mental health is like spirituality is not part of mental health, right? And I always remind people that literally what psychology means is the study of the soul, right? And so if you look even at the root of psychology, you know, European white mental health kind of abandoned the origin of psychology. And so as a psychologist, I'm very critical of Western psychology, but also reminding folks, or even, you know, um, trying to teach from more of a traditional approach of saying mental health and wellness has always been within BIPOC communities. How do we as providers and how do we as a system learn from the communities, right? And kind of shift the mindset of, do we really need to destigmatize mental health, or do we need to humble ourselves and know and accept that we don't know half of what we need to know to really provide, culturally, not just culturally relevant and culturally congruent, but going back to what Dr. Ingram and many have said, anti-oppressive approaches to mental health. So
Absolutely, and you're so right. The experts are our community members, and how can we learn from them, grow from them, implement them into research, implement them into programming, and also be able to hold the systems that do exist accountable, questioning them, bringing in spirituality, bringing in other aspects and determinants of our lives to best, serve our community. So thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Ingram, did you want to share on this question?
I have so much to say, but I'm also conscious of our time and
Mhm.
how many other questions. But I would just agree with what my colleagues have said. And just for me, I think raising awareness it starts with educating people. And so I'm a firm believer in talking about it and talking about it at a lot of times and in different places in different ways. And one of the things that I'm working on with the Department of Mental Health is to come up with a resource directory that is geared toward Black and African heritage folks in particular. And so what we're looking for are service providers, products, anything that people are doing that is uplifting the community, that is focused on wellness, not just mental illness or mental health, but again, looking at the more holistic way that we all have to live. Because again, if we don't address the whole person and all the things that influence their lives, we're shortchanging mental health. And so to really shift how we think about mental health from this sort of individualistic uh, approach, but also looking at the environment and how much we have to work on the environment that's going to be conducive. And that comes through educating. When it's like, what's the thing about you can give a man a fish, but you can teach him how to fish.
Mhm.
And so again, I want to teach people, which is one of the reasons why I moved out of direct service in mental health into education. Because I think we have to educate our community. That's been our way of liberation for as long as you can think. I look at Paulo Freire's liberations. And so again, and even what Dr. Madrano was talking about, liberation psychology, is that we have to educate people about themselves, about their environment, about the powers, about oppression. It's been hidden in normality, if you will. And so we need to change that and let people know, no, ain't nothing wrong with you. You just got all this other crap going on in your lives that are oppressing you and causing you to have these symptoms, which are normal, and normalize behavior more as a reaction to. But then also, how do we bring in factors that mitigate the impact of oppression? And that's kind of what I think is so important in terms of, I know we're going to talk more about action steps,
Mhm.
but those are the action steps I think we need to have.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you highlighted education as a part of raising awareness, because I think when we think of the very traditional classroom, we just think of like sitting and listening. But here you are compiling resources so that it makes the learning easier. We're here to listen, we're here to talk, we're here to fail, we're here to succeed. So it's just being able to have all of those components as a learning process through this. So I really do appreciate you sharing that. So thank you all again for sharing your thoughts on the importance of mental health awareness in the BIPOC community. Now we'll again shift the conversation to turning awareness into action. So once an individual or community has established mental health awareness, what are the next steps that you suggest they take to turn their awareness of mental wellness into active steps into improving or even maintaining their overall mental health? Also, what are maybe some effective coping strategies you have used or would encourage BIPOC students to adopt in their mental health journey? So I'm kind of combining a couple of the questions here, but curious about more of these action steps. And Dr. Ingram, since you've kind of teased a little bit about those active steps, would you like to go ahead and elaborate on that?
Well, I think the act of becoming aware is a behavior that's an actionable behavior. So I think that act in and of itself is significant in starting to see change happen on so many levels. So that's one thing. I think the other thing, especially for people who come from under-resourced communities or marginalized communities, is we need to connect. One of the major factors that mitigates the impact of racial oppression and all the other isms oppression is having a strong cultural identity.
Mm.
So, and that also comes from connections. So we need to connect with each other. I mean, we talk about Suicide Prevention Month is October, and one of the major things I used to tell folks is just reach out and talk to someone. Just one time, say hi, acknowledge someone. It may not be a close friend, but if you haven't talked to them in a month, call them. Just say, hey, how you doing? I work with thousands of people who have been suicidal. And one of the things that was missing for all those folks is that there wasn't anyone that they could connect to, or at least they saw as someone they could connect to. And so building those social connections, um, it helps to inoculate you from the stress of the environment and all kinds of issues. So I think one actionable thing you can do is outside of educating yourself is to connect with someone or somebody, and even to connect with your culture. Engage in cultural rituals, engage if it's going to church, looking at your spirit, yourself, your family. Not everybody's got a family they want to connect with, but we all can make a family. So making sure that you have those social connections, and there's neurobiology that supports that, releases that oxytocin, all those other sort of endorphins that automatically help you to feel better. And so again, all of the science now is coming together to really speak to the issue of connection, and not social media connection, because that's not the same kind of connection. You have to touch someone, you have to be in physical proximity to someone. That's what's going to change those biochemicals in the brain that help you to feel better. So for communities that are marginalized, that's how we have been resilient, is that we rely on each other. We connect with each other. We support each other. You look at Western medicine, as Dr. Marjana has mentioned, and it talks about individualization or individualizing. And it's really about connecting and social cohesion. We have to connect because there's too many powers that be out there that are going to tear you down. But when you have your folks in your back who are there for you, you can attack anything. You can succeed. So that to me is an action that everyone can take. Doesn't require degrees, doesn't require anything except your ability to reach out and connect to someone else. So that to me is one of the major actionable items that people can engage in beyond educating themselves.
Absolutely. And there are just so many different avenues to be able to connect. And I know connecting can bring a lot of anxiety for people, a lot of discomfort. But like you mentioned, whether it be social media, but also expanding beyond social media in the classroom, in churches, in places of worship, and in other parts of your community, that's a perfect place to get started. So thank you for sharing that. Would anybody else
Mhm.
like to share on this question?
I think forums like this also help to raise awareness. So more forums like this, and letting students know and letting the community know that, about letting them know about the different mental health services available in the community. A lot of times people just don't know or don't know how to access them. We have a lot of services around us here, but people don't understand, how don't always understand, I should say, how to access them. For example, like we have behavioral health services here at APLA Health that are open to the community, to student population. People can just call and say, hey, I would like to talk to a mental health provider. But making um, that process, making the community aware of that process, and through a resource directory or a guide, which has already been mentioned, and I think that helps raise awareness and also help people to take that next step of like, okay, how do I connect with a professional or a spiritual advisor, and using some non-traditional resources. A lot of times people are either connected to mental health services through a spiritual leader, whether it's a pastor or a minister, um, or through a medical provider, really helping people to understand that, there are different avenues to getting the services that you need, but making them aware of those different possibilities.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up such a great point because a lot of people are so ready to, explore their mental health and how it's, and like Dr. Ingram has mentioned already, how my environment has affected me and why I am this way. And sometimes it's just simply like, where do I start? Where do I get started? So you're right, having these resources completely available, that is our job as community leaders, as people here at the university to provide that to our community and our student body, so that it takes that barrier away of, not knowing and being unaware of the things that are out there for our students that are seeking this support. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Madrano, would you like to share on any action steps or, yeah, coping strategies?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think like my colleagues were saying, I think that there's just, there's so much that we can start tapping into, but I wanted to just, also mention that when somebody starts building that insight and that introspection around mental health, it's almost like the floodgates open and they start becoming aware of everything that's impacting them and their mental health, going back to like the systems, the environment, right? And so I always tell my clients and even my students, once I start teaching them from like a liberation psychology, they're like, oh, so it's bigger than just, yeah, me, right? And my little internal ecosystem. And I'm like, so I tell people, okay, take a step back. Like, you don't have to know all of it now, right now. You don't have to tackle every single part of your mental health and wellness. But I'm also a somatic practitioner. So for me, especially for bodies of color, like our bodies and our nervous systems are constantly under attack, right? And so even just like let's tap in to the breath, let's take a moment to even acknowledge that our breath, is in and of itself, allowing us to exist. So for me, I really think as a coping, mechanism is even just acknowledging how your body is feeling sometimes, um, going out into nature, doing some sort of somatic, so body work, right? If you're interested in yoga, tapping into yoga, meditation for those of us that have a very activated nervous system might not actually be the best because stillness for, when there's been a lot of unsafety, yeah, can actually be triggering, right? So people are like, I can't meditate. I'm like, that's okay. It took me years to even get to a point where I could slow down my nervous system enough or create safety, right? So again, the world is so unsafe for BIPOC bodies. How do we create safety within our bodies? So Dr. Ingram talked about like, connecting with community, right? David, what resources. So again, we don't have to do it alone neither. We can, find spaces and folks that we can co-regulate with. So for me, it's really about there's so much power when we can regulate ourselves and we can find our own center and our own groundedness when the whole world and our environment is so unstable. There's so much power when you can see people when they're in their center, right? Because there's always going to be so much that is going to try to pull us off our center. So there's power, especially when you see bodies of color going like, no, I have found my power, I have found my center. um so that has been very helpful in my work, but also personally to be able to cope with the attacks, that I have been witnessing, right, in our communities of like, okay, how do I come back to my center so that I can be of service to my communities?
Absolutely. And as you're talking, I'm like envisioning roots being planted into the soil as opposed to being a feather in the wind, with education, with raising awareness, connecting, safety, resource awareness. All of these things are roots to help us be able to grow into these holistic people that, experience the storms of life and experience the storms of that what happened within us and the things that are happening around us as well, too. So thank you all just so much for bringing that up. And Dr. Madrano, I know you just mentioned about just being overwhelmed by knowing all these things. I'm going to actually kind of skip down to this question. I'm curious to hear about what y'all have to say, but especially in this digital age, many social media users on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, a lot of people are starting to self-diagnose themselves with mental health conditions like ADHD, autism, depending on the content that they interact with. So I'm kind of just curious about what you all think are the pros and the cons of self-screening. Mental health screening is a very important tool and a very important way to kind of get us activated into these action steps of exploring our mental health outcomes. But yeah, I'm just curious if anybody would like to share their thoughts or even experiences when it comes to social media and self-diagnosing and self-screening.
I'll just start here. You know, I don't see anything wrong with self-screening as a start. I don't, but as an end, of course, there could be lots of problems. That would be like me self-diagnosing medical conditions. I mean, there are I mean, there's usefulness in that, I'm learning something about, different things, and that some things may be applicable to me, but, I can't solve my own medical problems that may need professional attention. And so I would say the same thing with self-diagnosing mental illness or self-screening. Um, it could provide some information and some insight, but it needs to be taken to the next step that, okay, maybe I, I think I have these symptoms. I should go see a professional. If it gets people in the door of a professional, I think that's a great thing. Um, but it could be and then people um may just shut down over it if they think that they may have a certain diagnosis or a certain problem, but that some of that has to do with stigma. But it could go either way, I think, but as long as people use it as a starting point, I think that's great. But if it's a start and an end, I don't think that's a great thing.
Absolutely, and it's like it's about, like, knowing how to utilize the tools because social media can be a tool, but is not, the end all be all. That's why, our professionals exist here, so, I do really appreciate you sharing that. Dr. Ingram, did you have some thoughts?
Um, yeah, I guess I think like David was saying, I think it's a plus and a minus. Again, having been in mental health for decades, diagnoses are only a small part of who you are.
Mhm.
And, as we say, I am not my diagnosis. And so if people get sort of stuck on their diagnosis, they miss the whole person. It does not have your narrative. It doesn't tell your story, and we need to be able to tell our stories. And so, yes, if we use screening tools to start the process to build our awareness, that's fine. But it's just like, I know enough to know when I have a flat tire, but don't ask me to change it. I'm gonna screw it up somehow, right? I call AAA. They're trained in changing flat tires, even though I know what it is, and I recognize it when I get that bump and sound. I don't want to go out and try and change tires. So I think it's still the same thing. It's a great place to start, but it is not the end place. And I find that when people rely too much on diagnosis, they become labels that lose meaning but can be used against you in a court of law. So I'm always cautious. I said, I don't care what someone's diagnosis is. Tell me how it's impacting your life. Tell me what's going on with you. Tell me your story. I want to hear your story. I don't want to hear your diagnosis because it doesn't mean anything. And there's so much bias in diagnosing.
Mhm.
Now everybody's a narcissist since we have a president who symbolizes narcissism, and people have been calling that word. And so now every time you turn around, oh, you're a narcissist. Really? Not everybody is a narcissist. Some people are just selfish, you know, or self-centered. But again, it loses its importance when it's overutilized, and it doesn't help. So again, what we want it to be is a helping situation. And so screening is important, because it helps you to build your awareness, but it is not where you live. We talked about, I know on our college, when I was at USC, we were looking at um, utilizing the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study as a screening tool, to help recognize when students were going to have challenges. And so I always get mixed. I totally believe in the ACE study and the ACE screening. Where we use it and how we use it is important, because I don't want it, we're going to use it like all freshmen coming in, which, having been a college professor, sometimes I say, yeah, that might not be a bad idea. But how do we use it, is important. And so I don't agree that all freshmen have to go through and have that screening, because it can do more damage than good. But it is a place to start with folks. I mean, I looked at it, my advocacy was to have it in student health, and all you got to do is ask one question about trauma. You don't have to go through all the questions that are in that survey, though. Again, it helps to raise your awareness. So it's kind of like, how far do we go? Is this all we're going to do? How are we going to use it? Because it can be used against you. So mixed feelings. It's a mixed bag. It's controversial, but I think some type of screening is always going to be important, just so you can raise your awareness, but not so it becomes the treatment.
Absolutely. And I really like how you brought up like having screening tools and other resources in other parts of the especially in the university aspect, in our health centers, in our classrooms, in administration, because I think it's so easy to doom scroll. That's the big word right now, is doom scrolling, and just like one thing after another, and algorithms just feeding you exactly, what they want you to hear and all these things. And again, like you have both mentioned so far, it's a great starting point to help build that awareness. But how can us as community supporters and student supporters be able to attribute to better things to their mental health outcomes? So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Madrano, did you have anything else you'd like to share on this part about social media?
Yeah, just real quick, because I know we're kind of getting to time, but um Yes, I completely agree with my colleagues. I think as a starting point, right? I think that accessibility obviously is a big issue, right? For many communities of, well, to get as an adult and even as a child, right? To get a full evaluation for ADHD or for, spectrum disorder, it could cost thousands of dollars, right? Out of pocket. Like even me as a psychologist, I'm not trained to evaluate for ADHD. I would have to take extra training for that. And I would then have to, or I would have to refer my clients to someone that is trained to do a full ADHD evaluation. Um, I'm very critical of the DSM-5 or all the DSMs. We know that they have been authored by mostly psychiatrists, white male, Western focused psychiatrists. And we also know that it has been funded greatly by the pharmaceutical companies. And so there is a lot of biases when it comes to these diagnoses just in regards to that. We also know that ADHD, there's a lot of overlap with trauma. So I don't think we have enough information. I think it's important for a lot of people once they know, okay, this is maybe what's happening to me or this is what I'm experiencing, there is a lot of relief of like, okay, this makes sense to me right now. I can do something knowing that I have this diagnosis or this label. But my fear is that we are kind of maybe dismissing, like, has this person also experienced trauma? We also know that we are living in a digital age. So the Gen X brain versus the Gen Alpha brain is very different. And so how our brains have been wired in the last 10, 20 years, does that contribute to these symptoms of ADHD? So I think there's a lot of science, I think that's just catching up. And so for someone to self-diagnose with certain, labels and that be it, and not take into consideration again trauma for womb holders, hormonal changes, if you're going into perimenopause and menopause, there's lack of concentration, like all these symptoms that very much mimic some diagnosis like ADHD. So we're not, again, are we doing a holistic, right, approach? Or are we just going like, okay, TikTok said I could take this test and therefore I can say I meet criteria for this, and then we're missing potentially very vital information. So again, I think it's great to be able to have these resources available, especially if we don't have accessibility to get appropriate care. But I would say also tap into, again, I'm a big believer of really, really, kind of abandoning this idea that we are the only experts. There's people in the community that have no quote unquote formal, degrees or formal education, but can really talk about how the brain and how the nervous system functions from a more holistic approach, right? Or have a more, non-Western training. So we need to tap into that as well, right? Of like, okay, what other providers or what kind of other holistic providers can we tap into to understand how we're showing up, especially right now. I think our brain is being structured differently, not just because of our own individual trauma, but again, our collective traumas, the fact that our brain is now being wired because we're seeing things live as it
Mhm.
happens. I'm a Gen Xer. I didn't grow up with seeing and knowing everything, as it was happening. So I think that there needs to be more studies and more information of how that is now showing up for folks.
Absolutely, because we have seen how much it is already starting to impact our nervous system and our brains and our emotions, all of that stuff as holistic people. So, thank you all so much for sharing that. And I've been hearing a lot of buzzwords like trauma, accessibility, even narcissism and narcissistic behaviors. We've kind of just throw around these words. So, for our last question, I know we're short on time. I'd like us to just focus on self care because self care has also become a very trendy, buzzy word over the past few years. So, how do you suggest communities of colors turn trends into traditions? So, in other words, what are some ways we can turn these short term self care techniques, whether it be going to one-on-one therapy, being a part of mutual aid work, anything like that, to these more long-term habits of just being able to implement strategies into our daily lives.
Well, I'll jump in on the self-care. I think I went through a shift because at first I was like, from a therapist, self-care is important, yada yada yada. Then I went to, oh, self-care is a very privileged position, and now I'm back to, yeah, self-care is needed. And but I think it's self-care in multiple modalities, in multiple ways. And so again, I go back to connections, having some good, trusting, non-toxic people in your life that you can rely on, that you feel safe with, is a form of self-care. Making sure that you have time for yourself so you can reflect. Again, it is hard to meditate, especially if you had a lot of trauma, to quiet your brain down to do that if you don't feel safe. So, really building opportunities and spaces that are safe for people is a self care approach. And so, self care isn't just going to the spa, it isn't just getting a massage, it's so much more than that. So, that I would encourage people to look at all the ways you take care of yourself. Some of them may not be healthy as others. And so, what we want to do is replace those that are not very healthy with those that may be more healthy. But whatever you do to help you feel better, to help you feel relaxed, I support. But I also tell people, well, let's talk about some ways that are more healthy for you than going out and downing a gallon of Haagen-Dazs, which I think is wonderful. It may not be the healthiest thing to do every day, but it definitely, there's a place for it in the continuum of self-care approaches. So I think it's about balance. Living your life in balance is another self-care approach, not working 24/7 and then volunteering 24/7. But again, building those spaces where you can just have time to reflect are important. And if that means you reflect with music in the background. So I think it looks different for different folks. I think in communities that tend to be under-resourced, they tend to be marginalized, we have survived this long doing self-care. We just need to sort of recognize those things that work for us and continue to do them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel necessarily, but like I said, things in the culture, all cultures have this sort of rejuvenation aspect to it. In order to, for the people to survive, we have to engage in this mutual care as well as self-care. So those are kind of what I look at. And so it doesn't matter. I even talk to people about gardening. And a lot of people don't know there's science behind putting your hands in soil. There's this bacterium in soil that penetrates the skin and raises your endorphins, raises, I think, serotonin. Who knew that? But now we go back and we find out that, wow, there's some science attached to that. Just laughing, that's self-care. There's science attached to that now, we know. Singing. So things that are so common that we don't think about are really ways that we take care of ourselves naturally. So again, it doesn't have to be this artificial, let me go to a spa and spend $200. Let me go out and sing in my car. I used to teach adults how to use to make bubbles, get one of those little bubble things and blow, not just with the mechanical thing, but literally blow bubbles when you're stuck in traffic. People may look at you, but you're going to feel better, or driving your car, singing at the top of your lungs when you're stuck in traffic here in LA, which is a biggie. That's a self-care technique.
Yeah.
So there's so many things that we do that we are not even aware are natural ways of taking care of ourselves that we need to acknowledge. And I think that helps.
Absolutely, and I always say you're never too old to play with bubbles because it really does bring something out of
Never.
you. Never too old. I still to this day, and I'm just really glad that you are also sharing just all different types of avenues of self-care. Every single one of you have talked about accessibility being a huge portion of this. Yeah, not all of us can go and spend hundreds of dollars at a spa, but we can laugh. We can find ways to laugh. We can find ways to get our feet in the soil, even in grass. Like there's even science, that same science of just barefoot walking in the grass and just being able to connect and ground ourselves. So I think you've shared an awesome variety of different self-care tips. And I know we're at time, but David or Adriana, did you want to share anything else about self-care or anything along those lines? And how they can be more long-term too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll share kind of maybe a non-conventional approach to
Yeah.
self-care. So for those of you that are into like astrology and like your zodiac and your big three, look at your moon sign and your Venus. So your moon sign is what you need to feel safe, and your Venus is how you love, including self-love. So for me, my moon isn't an earth sign. I won't give away too much information about myself. Um, but as an earth sign moon, I need my home to be like comfortable. I need my needs, my basic needs to be met. So to me, it's like my home is a form of self-care, right? Of being able to be home and come home and cook the foods I want and, listen to the music I want and smell the candles that I turn on. Like that's my self-care, right? Self-love. Self-love now with my Venus is in a water sign. So I love very deeply. I love very, very intentionally. And so for me, that self-love needs to be very intentional, which means I need to protect my time. I need to protect my space. And that's something I had to learn over time. So for those of you that are into, look up your natal chart. You for those of you that, there's cafeastrology.com. I think you can get one for free. Just put in your birth date. You do need your time of birth. Um, but those are just my suggestions for that.
Yeah, thank you for giving us ideas to explore outside of that. And yes, time of birth is very important because I had my incorrect time of birth and it changed my entire chart and therefore everything that I experienced in life. No, not really, but it did, and it's very important. It's really awesome to understand, like again, how these things happen, why they happen, all just everything being so intersected as our entire whole person, and especially when it comes to practicing Indigenous and other practices as well is so important. So, David, would you like to finish us off here?
Sure. I'll just start out with that self-care doesn't have to be complicated and it doesn't have to be expensive, as already been mentioned. I know most of us, I know a lot of people and I have friends, but there is one or two or even three people that I know whenever I talk to, they're going to have me rolling on the floor laughing. Sometimes you just need to call those people up and just have a good belly laugh, which I do on occasions. The other thing I had to do in more recent times is turn the TV off and stop listening to the news. That's been helpful. But j just sitting quietly, and contemplating, my life and just listening to music is sometimes all it takes for me and what I really like to do to sort of unwind.
Absolutely. And in the words of Kendrick Lamar, turn the TV off, turn the TV off. So, thank you all so much for sharing very accessible ways to care for ourselves, and kind of turning this big buzzword into a very traditional um, aspect and behaviors that our students can start implementing into their daily lives even starting today. A lot of students aren't able to work, or they do work and they have dependents and children and all these things going on, so being able to provide easy, uncomplicated, accessible ways to take care of themselves is huge. So um, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm definitely feeling very inspired after today's discussion, and I hope you all are too, and have even found some new ways to turn mental health awareness into action. I think it's a great time to be alive during this time where we can attest to the improvements of mental health resources and services. especially in our BIPOC community. And at the same time, our livelihoods and professions, as we know, are continuously under threat. So continuing to learn ways to advocate for ourselves and for our neighbors is extremely important. So I want to thank our panelists again for their insightful and inspiring responses today. If anybody has any questions or would like to start mental health services like case management, or even one-on-one therapy, or explore any other resources and services on campus and off campus, the Student Health and Wellness Center's contact information is, I can put that in the chat shortly, in case you would like to contact us about that. So, but again, thank you all for attending today's webinar. We hope to see you in future ones. I hope you can take care of yourselves. And again, thank you so much, panelists, for all your responses today, and hope you all enjoyed the panel as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.